Sidetrack episode 57. Who cares about Martin Luther? Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com to find more great thought-provoking and independent podcasts. You can learn more about the history of the papacy at all the usual places like a2zhistorypage.com. You can connect and like all of the social media from there and link to Apple Podcasts where you can leave a rating and review, which is always very appreciated. I hope you know the title of this episode is tongue-in-cheek, of course. October 31st, 2017 is more than just a day where I will either be required to pass out a bottomless bowl of candy treats to costumed children constantly ringing my doorbell, or walk for miles supervising costumed children constantly ringing doorbells for candy treats. No, October 31st, 2017 will mark the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther officially publishing his 95 Theses on the door of the All Saints Church Cathedral in Wittenberg, Germany, then a part of the Holy Roman Empire. Most of the time, this story is told from the perspective of Martin Luther and the Reformers. I want to look at the Reformation and Martin Luther from an outsider's perspective, if you will. What did the papacy think of Luther? Was Rome and the Catholic Church as completely corrupted as Luther and the other reformers portrayed? What else was going on in the world politically and religiously at the time? If I may take a moment to plug our sister show Beyond the Big Screen, well, you can look forward to a collaboration with Ben Jacobs of the podcast Wittenberg to Westphalia. We talked about the life of Martin Luther and his movement through several movies, Luther from 1953, the equally descriptively titled Martin Luther from 2003, and a few others. The 95 Theses being pinned to the door in Wittenberg is a key event in Ben's podcast, and I think you'll find the episodes entertaining and informative. So go out and listen to Beyond the Big Screen and Wittenberg to Westphalia. Also, before we dive into this episode, I'd like for you to consider advertising on the Agora Podcast Network. The Agora Podcast Network offers a variety of advertising options and can really help you get your message out to a large, diverse, and unique audience. Go over to agorapodcastnetwork.com or email to our sales team at info@agorapodcastnetwork.com. Okay. Now let's talk about Martin Luther. First off, let's start with the Crib Notes version of Martin Luther's life. We'll take the story as close to the bare bones and with as little commentary as possible. Luther was a man of Central Germany, which was a part of the Holy Roman Empire. Luther traveled very little outside of his zone of Central Germany. We'll have to get a little bit into the Byzantine nature of Holy Roman imperial politics and how the empire interfaced with its neighbors soon. But let's get Luther's life up and running first. Luther was born in Eisleben to a semi-successful miner. In and around the year 1500, Luther went off to university to study philosophy and law. He attended the university at Erfurt and Magdeburg. In 1505, Luther became an Augustinian monk. It's sort of a fun story as to how he stumbled into this vocation as an Augustinian monk. One day, Luther was traveling the road and was stuck in a really terrible thunderstorm. He made a vow if he survived, he would become a monk, and there you go. Luther lived as a monk in Erfurt. He continued his studies and in 1507 was ordained a priest. In 1510, Luther was sent on a trip to Rome, where he was very much less than impressed with what he saw there. At least that's the after-the-fact narrative, but maybe not necessarily what really happened. Not too long afterward, Luther received a doctorate in philosophy and theology, along with attaining a high rank in the Augustinian order. He was responsible for managing 11 Augustinian monasteries or chapter houses. You could sort of say he was an upper-level manager of the Augustinians. During the years of the early 15 teens, Luther really delved deeply into the theologies of Augustine and the cutting edge of late medieval theology and philosophy. At this time, Luther really embraced much of the ideas of Augustine of Hippo, and especially Augustine's writings against Pelagius. Through all of this, Luther started to formulate his core ideas, such as salvation comes from faith alone, sola fide. Work, such as participating in the sacraments, was not nearly as important as faith and following the Gospels, the Gospel word directly. And around 1516, Pope Leo X really pushed a big campaign of indulgences. Indulgences are a very complicated topic. We get a very narrow idea of what indulgences were and are all about from the Reformation telling of this story. Indulgences were really at the very heart of papal theology. Basically, the Pope, as Christ's representative on earth, had a bank account of grace which the Pope could use on earth. That power could be wielded in a very holy or a very shady manner, depending on who was using it, how it was being used, and how the use of indulgences was perceived. Pope Leo X inherited a church that was definitely in need of some reform, and he saw that. Leo had different ideas on how that reforming would look. He thought issuing a special indulgence would be a good way to set a clean table and raise a little much-needed cash as a side benefit. Many people, including Martin Luther, did not like these indulgences one bit. In these years, Luther started down a road he probably couldn't have predicted, but it was down a road that would almost inevitably lead him away from the Roman Pope-based Christianity. The most important step was when Luther placed his 95 Theses on the door of Wittenberg Cathedral. Not everything Luther wrote in these grievances were that controversial, and really the points he made were meant to spark a debate. I mean, he was an academic after all, and that's what they did. They debated, they argued, and went back and forth. Almost immediately, though, the 95 Theses took on a life of their own. They became the late medieval viral news, using the latest terminology, of course, and then they used the printing press to spread the word all around Germany and beyond. This is the part of the story that often turns into lore, polemics, and apologetics. Often, at least in the English-speaking world, we get a very Luther-centric view of what happened. Let's try and turn things around to see things from another point of view. It's often said that Christianity is extremely fractured. People say Christianity is fractured to its core. That statement has some truth to it, but also some hyperbole. Christianity was quite diverse during the first two-ish centuries of its existence, but by about the 4th century, Christianity had primarily settled into one set of ideas based on the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed, or Statement of Beliefs. Pretty quickly after that, the church split over interpretation of that creed into 3 main branches. If we use the imagery of a tree, we can see a lot of roots that coalesced into one trunk that quickly separated into 3 trunks. The biggest trunk was the Roman imperial trunk. That main trunk was a little unstable, though, as the relationship between the Eastern Greek and the Western Latin parts of the empire were never super comfortable living together. By the time of Luther, the Eastern and Western imperial churches split it into 2 separate trunks, the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Orthodox Church in the East. Sometimes this church is called the Greek Orthodox Church, and it certainly had a very strong Greek flavor, but it also included Russian, Serbian, Arabic, and even some Latin influences. Each of these other Christian traditions had their own views on Luther, especially the Roman Catholic Church. It's important to look at the world of 1517 from the perspective of the popes in Rome. This was a very, very difficult time to be a Roman or a pope. The popes of the later half of the 1400s and the 1500s were not perfect saints by any stretch of the imagination, but they also were not the devilish caricatures they were often portrayed as. The popes of this time found themselves in a very difficult predicament. They were the secular lords of a decent slice of land right in the middle of central Italy. It was a good land to hold, but incredibly difficult to defend. The papal states, or papal patrimony as it's sometimes called, was completely surrounded by would-be enemies and allies. Let's take a look at the papal states neighborhood so we can get a sense of the dangerous political environment the popes found themselves living in. Immediately to the south was the Kingdom of Naples. The Kingdom of Naples was an odd principality that rolled out of the High Middle Ages. Control of this kingdom was a constant struggle between different French and Spanish dynasties. Naples was highly involved in papal politics as well. Naples was itself constantly being batted around by the bigger powers of the day, and its loyalty could swing back and forth between these powers, thus making the Kingdom of Naples a strong papal ally or a dangerous enemy depending on the day of the week. Let's step into another political mess. The city-states of northern Italy. The most powerful of these states were Milan, Venice, Florence, and Genoa, but there were any number of other smaller states that were incredibly important too, such as Siena and Pisa, Lucca, etc. All of these cities had their own internal politics and their own external relations. Modena could be friendly with the papal states one day and then shift alliance to another city-state or kingdom and be at war with the papal states the next day. On top of that, a very large percentage of the College of Cardinals was made up of churchmen from these city-states, meaning these small yet powerful republics had a direct line and say into church decisions and even who the next pope would be. Then we have France. The French crown liked to think of itself as incredibly Catholic and pious, but they really didn't like listening to what the popes had to say very often. France had a lot of irons in the political fires of Europe. As much as they saw themselves as the bulwark of Christian Europe, they were all about realpolitik, even making alliances with the Turks when it was advantageous. To the west was Aragon and Castile, and the other states that made up Spain. It was only in 1492 that the Catholic rulers of Spain were able to finish the Reconquista and reconquer the last Muslim principality in the Iberian Peninsula. That was the main focus of Spain, but the kings and queens of Castile and Aragon still had their fingers in a number of different diplomatic situations throughout southern Europe, and even into northern Europe. The rulers of Spain also saw themselves as a powerful defender of Christianity and the papacy. One thing with Spain, after 1492, they moved from being a significant regional power to what could be considered a world power after the discovery of North America by Christopher Columbus. Portugal was also highly involved in this age of discovery. Spain and Portugal were making piles of riches and were opening up places that were unheard of or even considered legendary just a decade and a half earlier to colonization and Christianization. I thought this would be a good time to quickly apologize for the delay between new episodes of the History of the Papacy. Believe me, I'm working very hard every day on reading, researching, and writing new episodes. As many of you already know, I have a new podcast called Beyond the Big Screen, where I talk with interesting and knowledgeable guests about the background, context, history behind some really great movies. I think you will find that the Beyond the Big Screen podcast episodes are very much in the vein of the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm really trying to find the backstory and give a fuller story on a variety of topics through the lens of a movie. Right now, I'm doing a series on the Protestant Reformation, so that topic may definitely be of interest to many listening today. I really think that you will enjoy this new podcast and will give you something new to listen to in between histories of the papacy episodes. You can find Beyond the Big Screen on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, Acast, and A2ZHistoryPage.com. Before we go into the final state, or more properly, political entity that was highly involved in papal politics, we should talk about the institution of the College of Cardinals. The College of Cardinals formed the government of the Papal States and the Catholic Church. The cardinals elected the popes from amongst their own ranks, and they filled the most important roles in the curia. These cardinals came from all over Europe, so naturally they brought in the politics of their home countries, along with the internal politics of the church. If what we've laid out already hasn't made you think of that weird 3D chessboard from Star Trek, just wait until we bring in this one last European political entity into the situation. Directly to the north of the Italian city-states was the Holy Roman Empire. The HRE, for short, derived its holiness and its Romanness from the Church of Rome, and for the most of the past several hundred years, the Holy Roman Emperors did not like that. Now, just keep in your mind, Martin Luther was in the Holy Roman Empire. The HRE had a very long and very complicated past with the papacy and Italy, going back to at least the 700s or 800s. Arguably, the relationship goes back even earlier with the precursor kingdom of the Franks. We could go on and on about this complicated relationship. Throughout the early and up to the High Middle Ages, large swaths of Italy were under the direct control of the Holy Roman Empire. I should also take a quick second that if you really want to learn more about this Holy Roman Empire and this period in European history, Travis Dow's History of Germany podcast fills in a lot of the blanks, and he gets into a lot of the nitty-gritty of their history. So I would definitely suggest, if you're not already listening to that show, you should definitely listen to it to help fill in some of the blanks that we'll necessarily not dive into here. Relations, preferences, and allegiances between Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor were the basic political arguments for centuries. The aristocracy of northern Italy was completely enmeshed with Holy Roman imperial politics. As a matter of fact, many of their northern Italian city-states aristocracies originally came from the Holy Roman Empire and points northward and assimilated into Italian culture. The HRE provided many of the popes for centuries and were always highly involved in who was elected pope. Wars were fought between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in Italy. Guelph deriving from the German house of Welf, and the term Ghibelline derived from an equally Germanic name, Wilbelligen. The Guelph-Ghibelline political factional divide was the main conflict in Italy for hundreds of years, and their very names are derived from German aristocratic households and place names. Indulge me for a brief moment of etymology sidebar. Both of these words changing from a W in German to a G sound in the Romance language, from Welf to Guelph and Wilbelligen, if you will, to Ghibelline, sound into the Romance languages is the same process that turned William or Wilhelm to Guillaume, Guillermo, as well as my own family name from the English but older German Wara to Guerra, my own illustrious surname. Thank you for that, indulging me on that. Now, Martin Luther was born in central Germany, far, far away from Rome. We're talking about what could be a month's journey or more by foot. Martin Luther was very plugged into the Catholic hierarchy of his region, but he couldn't have had any idea of what complications a pope in Rome had to deal with. All this is to say, it would be very easy for someone like Martin Luther, way up in northern Germany, to look down his nose at these superstitious, know-nothing, semi-pagan, wasteful Italians, all the while ignoring the real-world concerns the papacy and the Italians dealt with day in and day out for centuries. Now let's dig into what were Martin Luther's gripes. There are a few questions we should keep simmering on the back burner as we move forward. Were the 95 Theses new complaints? Were they legitimate concerns? Were the concerns represented in the 95 Theses being completely ignored? Did Luther bring up novel interpretations that the Catholic Church had arguments against? The standard Reformation line is that the Catholic Church of the Renaissance was a complete cesspit, and the Reformation thinkers came out, fixed all the problems, and returned to a pure form of Christianity with all that Roman innovation junk. It goes without saying the popes in Rome had something else to say on that matter. Indulgences was one of the really big problems Martin Luther had with the Church of Rome. We really don't have time to get into all the ins and outs of indulgences, but we can start to scratch the surface a bit. An indulgence is a sort of a pass from the temporal punishment imposed as penance for a sin. For a person to be eligible to receive an indulgence, they must be absolved of their sin and then have a penance imposed upon them. The indulgence is outside of the normal sacrament of absolution and confession. Sacramental confession evolved over the years, but the essential elements go all the way back to the Gospels. Jesus gave Peter the authority to bind and loose sins. What precisely binding and loosening means or meant, and who has the authority to do so after Peter was gone, was very much up for debate. In the early days, people would confess their sins in front of the entire congregation and then get their sins absolved. In confession, it's not the priest who is actually absolving the sins, it's God. And the priest is a pass-through or an intermediary. When a person was absolved of their sins, they were enjoined not to sin anymore. In the Gospels, Jesus would say, "Go and sin no more," in many of the stories where he forgave someone or somehow dealt with a sinful act. An idea developed that people should do some sort of penance to make a sign of an outward sign of contrition or sorriness for the sin that they did. The penance was up to the priest. And this penance was meant to help the person reflect on their sin, say pray more or fast for a certain amount of time. You can see how something pious like this could quickly be perceived as a punishment and become juridical or judicial. Confession and absolution traditionally didn't have anything to do with punishment. Penances could be very heavy, especially in the Middle Ages, and even though you were absolved of your sin, the penance would still be hanging around your head. And the penance wasn't just a piece of advice, it became an obligation and would be very bad not to do the required penance. That is where indulgences come into the game. The Pope, and to a much lesser degree bishops, could give a break on penance. If someone did a specific thing, they could get a waiver on their penance. They could even get some indulgences in the bank as a credit against future penances. In certain circumstances, indulgences were given for the punishment of sins that someone knowingly was going to commit in the future, such as in a war. Indulgences could be used to help out dead friends and relatives to knock a few years off their time in purgatory. Oh my goodness, now we have to talk about purgatory. But before we get into purgatory, I feel like I'm in purgatory right now trying to sort all this out. Let's talk about the economy first. Economy is going to be an issue when the church and church officials start selling indulgences. But in this instance, we are talking about something called oikonomia, which our modern word economy is derived from. In church talk, oikonomia is the authority bishops and priests to use their judgment when dealing with people in an official church business. It's sometimes called dispensation, especially in the West. Again, this all comes back to Jesus giving the power to bind and loose to Peter. The economy is what authorizes a bishop, priest, or pope the authority to determine the appropriate penance for a confessing sinner. It is also the authority to give people a pass on fasting certain days or bending many of the other rules to fit individual circumstances. It's really all about leniency. Over time, for a wide variety of reasons, the church in the West became less lenient in many ways. It really may have derived as power centralized into the Pope. The Pope took powers from local bishops and priests who could afford to be more lenient. But now that decisions were being made from a central hub, things had to become more standardized. I don't know, that's one theory, but there's many more. The church structure, though, became less about giving the priest discretion and more about legalistic or strict observance of rules and canons. All of this is to say the church believes it has the authority and power to have latitude in how it deals with people, their sin, and their religious lives. No matter if it's a priest, bishop, or pope, that's a part of the deal, and that's a part of indulgences. This is where another one of Martin Luther's major complaints came into play: purgatory. The idea of purgatory isn't directly mentioned in the Old Testament, the Gospels, or the letters. There are passages that allude to some sort of purification or purgation, but something like, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus said, oh yeah, there's purgatory too. There's nothing like that. Now, purgatory is a place where souls can go in the afterlife. Hell, or Hades, etc., is the place where souls that did not have salvation went. It was also reserved for people who were outside of the grace of the church upon their death. It could be a person who died excommunicated, weren't baptized, or otherwise unrepentant in their sins. So they went to a place where there was no chance of salvation. On the opposite end was heaven. If you've read the Paradiso or listened to the Great Cannonballs podcast on the Paradiso, heaven evolved to be a very complicated place in Roman Catholic theology. But in between heaven and hell was purgatory. This is the place where people who died inside of the good graces of the church, but still had some degree of sin that they needed to be cleansed of before entering heaven went. Again, this isn't directly from the Bible, but was built upon and developed over the centuries through what the Roman Church calls holy tradition and through church councils. Luther didn't have a very high opinion on the very existence of purgatory, and he certainly didn't think a pope, priest, or bishop had any say on what happened to a soul in the afterlife anyway. What Luther was doing here was attacking the very core of papal power and authority. He wasn't just reforming around the edges here. He was going after the very heart of the institution. Naturally, there was going to be some pushback against these assertions or theses Luther made. That leads to another issue, that of the importance of church councils and tradition. To Luther, the Bible was everything. If a doctrine couldn't be found in the Bible, then it was no good. This is so-called sola scriptura, by scripture alone. Luther bashed councils, church councils, up and down. What Luther knew, as much as any other, your next doctor of theology, was that church councils and tradition based on writings outside of the gospel went on long before the canon of Scripture was locked into place. As a matter of fact, Luther tweaked the canon quite a bit, especially as far as the Old Testament went. Luther also worked on translating the Bible into the German vernacular. Translating into the vernacular was not this brand new thing that Luther invented. For example, the Orthodox Church, not too far east of where Luther worked and operated, translated important documents such as the Gospels and other biblical books into the vernacular all the time. There was movements earlier in the West, too, to translate documents into the vernacular. but to a lesser degree, and there's some complications there. But it wasn't completely unheard of in the West to translate the Gospels into the vernacular. Now, the thing is, with making a Bible translation, is the translator has to make decisions on how to translate certain key words, phrases, and passages. This is a very delicate and complicated affair that takes a lot of knowledge of Latin, Greek, Hebrew. Not only all that, but the semantics of these languages at a very particular time in history. Bible translations were never taken lightly and usually was a very long-term project by a team of expert translators. When someone translates a book like the Bible, they're really saying that they are the authority to trust. Luther wasn't saying that there was no authority who could interpret the Bible. What he was saying was Luther himself was the proper authority. In the battle between Luther's reforming movement and the Roman Church, there are no clear right and wrong answers or good guys versus bad guys. Luther had some very important points to make. Luther also cut to the bone against the prerogatives the Church and the popes had claimed for nearly a millennium and a half. Reform isn't an absolute, and reform movements can easily go far beyond simple marginal changes. This is what the Reformation of Luther was all about. Luther's pressing of papal and church power gave way to many different reform movements that were percolating around Europe at the time. Further reformations came about that Luther was vehemently opposed to. The reform movements of Zwingli and Calvin would sweep away a good portion of the area that had initially adopted Luther's reforms, violently at times. In the meanwhile, the Roman Catholic Church was spreading across the world and the discoveries throughout these discoveries of Spain and Portugal. We've just begun to discuss and discover the Roman Church reaction to the Reformation of Martin Luther, which kicked off 500 years ago. There was a movement inside of the Catholic Church to clean house and push back against the Northern European reformers in what was called the Counter-Reformation. Look for future Sidetrack episodes to further discuss this momentous anniversary. We've only begun to scratch the surface of the Reformation from a different perspective. I don't have all of the ideas figured out quite yet, but we will very likely talk about some Catholic figures who were portrayed in less than a positive light, but who were very much more complicated and three-dimensional figures than what some reformers made them out to be. Please contact me if there is any area of the Reformation in the Church you would like to discuss further. I'd love to hear your questions and comments, so keep sending them in so we can commemorate this 500th anniversary in style. A huge shout out goes to our Rome level patrons, Peter the Great and Mary. Our Constantinople level patrons on Patreon, Sandy, Andy, Paul, Dr. Jeff, Robert, Sean, and Yoren, as well as our Alexandria level patrons, Francine and Richard. Speaking of Patreon, one of the new benefits of joining patreon.com/papacy at any level is access to a new series of bonus content called Off-Track episodes. These episodes include little bits of information I've learned along the way, read along the way, that don't really fit into the main episodes or even Sidetrack episodes. Even though they don't fit, off-track episodes are still really fun and relate to the topics we've discussed. So now you have even more great reasons and incentives to join the crew on Patreon. I really sincerely appreciate you taking the time to listen, and I look forward to seeing you on our next stop on our trip through the history of the Popes of Rome and Christian Church.